Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Uh, I'm very happy to welcome you all to the webinar today. Just before I start, if some of you can go into the chat section and write if you can hear me, so we can proceed forward. Am I audible to everybody? Okay, I'm getting few responses. Yes. If I can get some more responses, so I know that everybody can hear me, that would be wonderful. Okay, yes. That's very good. Thank you very much. So, welcome again, and I'd like to welcome you all to the webinar. Today, as a speaker, we have Mansi Dakpat. I'm just going to introduce you, ma'am, for a while, and then I'll pass it on to you, and we can proceed forward. So, Mansi Dakpat is Associate Professor at School of Audiology and Speech Language Pathology, Bharati Vidyapeeth University, Pune. She completed her bachelor's in hearing, speech and language from AYJ NIHS and completed her MASLP from BL Nair Hospital, Mumbai. She has submitted her PhD to Maharashtra University on profiling of communication and swallowing in individuals with motor neuron disorders. She is specialized in feeding disorder in neonates and swallowing disorder following neurological as well as head and neck cancer. She is trained in instrumental assessment of swallowing from Kerala Institute of Medical Sciences. She served as a committee member for standardization of clinical and instrumental assessment of dysphagia at World Dysphagia Summit, Barcelona in 2017. She is also served as an expert for Delphi study for expert opinion in VFSS parameters, Curtin University, Australia. She's also served as resource person in various national and international forums like World Congress of Neurorehabilitation, World Federation of Neurorehabilitation, Indian Speech and Hearing Association. And she also served as a mentor for Susan Langmore Fish training at Tata Memorial Cancer Hospital in Mumbai. She has presented lots of papers in national and international forums. She has published articles related to dysphagia in national and international forums as well. She is also a member of European Society of Swallowing Disorders, Indian Speech and Hearing Association, Indian Federation for Neurorehabilitation, and Foundation for Head and Neck Oncology. We're very happy and privileged to have you here with us, ma'am, today. And I'd like to pass it on to you for the presentation. And I'd like to request everyone to keep your questions together. And during the next part of presentation, you can give the questions in chat section, and we'll have a question answer by the end of it. Over to you, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, sir. Am I audible? Can I get some responses on that, please?
Yes, ma'am. You're audible.
Also, is my screen available for? Is my PPT being flashed?
Yes, ma'am. It's okay.
Okay, great. So at the outset, I would like to thank the Speech and Hearing Association of Nepal for inviting me as a resource person. It's always a privilege to speak on a very, very dear topic to me, that is swallowing disorders. So, we have divided today's lecture into two parts. So first, we will be going through the mechanism of swallowing, the swallowing disorders, the assessment protocols, and also some part of the intervention. And the second parts, I have a nice bouquet of videos for you with respect to flexible endoscopes as well as video fluoroscopies. So that will help you understand the clinical practice of the same. So what is swallowing? Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Okay, because I got a chat saying that I'm not audible. Okay, right. So swallowing is a highly coordinated function that requires a lot of intricacies between various systems of your head and neck, that is your oral cavity, your nasal cavity, your pharynx, your respiratory system, and it is governed by the mastermind, which is your nervous system. So if we look at the phases of swallowing in brief, The first few phases, the oral preparatory and the oral phase, are the voluntary phases where your bolus is prepared or held in position, depending on what the viscosity of the bolus is. And it is transited to the pharyngeal phase or the pharyngeal area for deglutition. The pharyngeal phase is a complex phase. Why? Because it is semi-automatic. Secondly, very important events that take place during the pharyngeal phase are the velopharyngeal closure. Now, this happens so that the food does not enter the nasal cavity. You have the hyolaryngeal elevation and laryngeal closure so that the food does not enter your airway. You have the relaxation of the cricopharynx so that the bolus enters safely into the esophagus. And this is a very underrated and a very under talked about discussion, that is the cessation of breathing, which is the deglutative apnea. Okay, so deglutative apnea is when you swallow, your larynx and your airway closes tightly so that the food does not enter the airway. And this is a normal phenomena which should be present in all patients. Further, we come to the esophageal phase. Once the cricopharynx has relaxed, you would have the esophageal phase where the bolus is passing from the esophagus to stomach. Now, this phase of swallowing is completely involuntary. Now, let us look at the causes. We usually learn about the causes as neurogenic and mechanical. We are aware of the neurogenic causes. Some of them are acquired, some of them are neonatal, some of them are antenatal in nature. With respect to mechanical dysphagia, we do have a lot of other things like we just talk about head and neck cancers, but very few of us know that even burns and corrosive poisoning can have a significant amount of dysphagia. Also, obstructive conditions like stenosis of the esophagus, strictures of the esophagus, presence of osteophytes. This is very, very commonly seen in old age. Presence of any esophageal web, any diverticuli, any pouches which are created in the pharynx and the esophagus would also lead to dysphagia. And the other causes are, we can also have dysphagia because of psychological causes like hysteria. There is something called as fear of swallowing because of any traumatic event. It's labeled as phagophobia. So those also come under the myriad of SLP practice. Like how we have presbycusis, we also have swallowing problem because of normal aging known as presbyphagia. And of course, in the current COVID times, I think we are going to be facing many of these cases due to prolonged intubation, due to respiratory conditions like ARDS, that is acute respiratory distress syndrome, stenosis, or any obstructive pulmonary disorders. And lastly, I have also encountered a few cases of dermatological nature, which are scleroderma or dermatomyositis, which also present with a lot of dysphagia. So if you can see in this slide, there is a huge range of disorders that we have a very important role to play on. And it is not any specific age group that we target. We see swallowing and feeding problems right from neonatal period till end of life. So it is a huge amount of work. Further, let us just briefly talk about the pathophysiology, neurogenic dysphagia. So those were the causes. Now, what happens when a person has a neurogenic condition? So due to neurogenic condition, you may have poor control of the CNS or the PNS, that is the central or the peripheral nervous system. You can also have a compromised function of cranial nerves because of either overexcitation or weakness. Also, conditions like Parkinson's disease, where we see imbalance of the neurotransmitters, can also impact your control circuitry, which are very important for dysphagia. You can also have individuals who have issues very typically at the neuromuscular junction level, for example, myasthenia gravis or any other polymyositis which affects the muscles directly, or muscular dystrophies for that matter. And we also have degenerative conditions like neuronal death or demyelinating condition, which lead to poor electrical transfer between the cell bodies, which can cause dysphagia. With respect to mechanical dysphagia are basically structural losses or any change in the muscles due to any surgeries or any procedure. So as we see, in many of you must be dealing a lot with head neck cancer patients. So we see either a complete or a partial loss of structure, which can lead to presence of dysphagia. Also, many of our patients who have undergone radiation therapy or are burn patients would say that they feel a lot of tightness, a lot of fibrosis in the muscles. Also, many a times a surgery can impact or can damage the surrounding nerve or tissue. For example, many of you must have seen patients with a CABG, that is your coronary artery bypass surgeries, who who are very possible to have a damage to the vagus nerve. Okay. Then also presence of a defect which will lead to infiltration of bolus. So in this category, you may have presence of a fistula, or you may have presence of any orocutaneous fistula. So those things also will lead to presence of aspiration or presence of collection of food bolus in the oral cavity wherever the fistula is present. Also, misalignment of structures. This is very typically seen in patients who have had a mandibulectomy. So patients who've had an anterior segmental mandibulectomy or who've had hemimandibulectomy, you would see that they would have a mandibular drift on the opposite side because they have loss of a structure on the opposite side. And also damage which happens due to dissection. Now let us see how frequent is structures which, okay. Am I audible? Because I thought I just got muted. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you are audible, ma'am.
Yes. Okay, thank you very much. So it is very important to see what is the percentage of swallowing problems that all these conditions carry. So the commonest thing that we see, the commonest condition that we see in our clinics is stroke, where around 65% of the patients who have had acute stroke have prevalence of dysphagia. Also, patients of traumatic brain injury, Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis have a very huge amount or a huge cluster of dysphagia. With respect to the head neck cancer, esophageal webs or radiation therapy, again, the numbers are pretty high, which goes on to around 50 to 80% of these cases. So again, the prevalence of dysphagia seems to be pretty high in these classes. Now, what we need to understand is that what is the impact that dysphagia has on an individual. So what we need to realize is that dysphagia, unlike other speech language disorders, swallowing is a reflex and it is very important for survival. So dysphagia has its own bundle of issues that come along with it. The most common one that we talk about is malnutrition, because due to dysphagia, the person is unable to satisfy his appetite, and very less amount of food, which is deemed normal for his age, actually reaches him. Secondly, due to dysphagia, a person can have food entering the airway, and this person is at a potential risk for something called as aspiration pneumonitis. I will show you the videos on aspiration as well in the next section. And all these things have a correlated impact on a person's quality of life. Now we know what is quality of life. It is the sense of well-being, and it allows you to participate in your social environment. So if a person who is maybe a 30 or a 40 or a 50-year-old has drastic dysphagia, it will impact not only his but his family's quality of life. So I think our aim is not only to treat dysphagia, but also to improve the quality of life of these patients and their family. So coming to the role of SLP, since this is the crux of the topic, firstly, we have to identify and diagnose the nature of the swallowing problem. Because I personally believe that a very good differential diagnosis of swallowing impairment would be like a half battle won. Okay. Secondly, we have to decide which is the feeding modality which would be immediately given to the patient so that he maintains nutrition. Whether a person is a safe oral swallower, if he has a lot of aspiration, should we put him on a feeding tube? The final goal, I hope everyone can see my slides. Hello, can everyone see my slides, please?
Yes, ma'am, the slides are okay.
Okay. So again, coming to the role of in continuation with the role of the speech language pathologist, our main aim again, as I want to emphasize is very, very clearly that it is not only to ensure safe swallow, but also to improve the quality of life of the patients. So let us start with the diagnosis part. So an early and accurate diagnosis is definitely a key to effective management. Once we know what the problem is, I think we can address it much better. But usually when SLPs talk, it is whether aspiration was present or not. So let us have a wider perspective. Dysphagia assessment is not only about whether aspiration is present or not. It is about understanding the physiology that is causing dysphagia and addressing that. So we usually carry out our swallowing examinations in two phases. We carry out a clinical swallow examination, and if there was an indication, we would do an instrumental assessment, right? So what does a clinical examination do? It provides us with a preliminary judgment on whether there is a swallowing problem or not, and it also forms your basis for a decision making with respect to further instrumental assessments. So some very important components of your clinical swallow exam should continue all of these. I will be talking about some protocols that we use in India and which have been published in literature. So a general assessment with respect to the cognitive status, medical status, level of comprehension of the patient would give us an idea whether this patient is ready for a detailed swallowing examination. Let me give an example over here. A person who is in coma or who is in a vegetative state with very poor arousal and who keeps on falling unconscious, I don't think I would want to proceed with a very elaborate clinical swallow examination, because again, I'm putting him at a risk for aspiration. We also have to review the medical and surgical reports so that we understand what has happened. We need to understand that dysphagia is a sign and a symptom. It is not the medical condition. So we have to get into the crux of what is the medical condition causing dysphagia. An OPME and a cranial nerve examination is very, very important, where I judge and the appearance, the strength, the range of motion of all the oral structures. This is something which is very, very important, the cuff assessment. Why? Because it is your protective reflex, and if a person has aspiration, we need to see what is his motor control or what is his voluntary strength of cough. And finally, after I have ensured that all these areas, that is your general assessment, the OPME, the cuff assessment are optimal, only then I would want to do a swallow examination with a food material. Otherwise, I can always stop at the dry swallow. So there are some very simple tools that you can have during your clinical swallow. I'm sure all of you use this. You can have a flashlight, tongue depressors, a taste material to check for the gustatory functions, the straw, glove, sanitizer, and I usually have a pediatric stethoscope or a pulse oximeter. I'll be talking about it in the further slides, why we need those. So some protocols that are available in literature, you can take a click of this if you want. Some screening tools. Now, the purpose of a screening tool is just to identify whether there is a swallowing problem or not. So I personally use a water swallow test. We also known as the water challenge test, where a patient can be asked to swallow a 5 ml of water or 100 ml of water, depending on the tolerance that the patient has. And we just identify whether there is a swallowing problem or not. The patient fails the test if there is any dribbling, or if there is any coughing present, or if the patient just spits out the water. That is when we say that the patient has failed the screening test and we have to do much more elaborate clinical protocols. With respect to specifically tracheostomy, there is something called as modified Evans blue dye test. As you can see in this picture, you can see the blue dye coming out, okay, of the tracheostomy. So what is actually done here is that you mix the blue color dye. I usually use the blue color dye because we do not have any bodily fluids which are blue in color, in as contrast to green, which is bile, and yellow and red. So the blue color would be mixed in the food material or in the water or in the ice chips. That will be placed on the patient's mouth and the patients will be asked to swallow. What we need to monitor is through the tracheostomy, are there any traces of the blue dye? Now we know that the tracheostomy is always created below the subglottic level. So if we see any blue traces, that means the aspiration has happened and the person has failed, or he has a positive sign of aspiration with respect to the Evans blue dye test. Now these swallow protocols like Mann assessment of swallowing ability are reliable and valid tools which have been concurrently validated with video fluoroscopy. We have Indianized tools like the Manipal Manual of Swallowing Assessment and Nair Hospital Bedside Swallow Assessment, which are very much elaborate to give you an idea of what the problem is like. And finally, let us not forget, like how we have a voice handicap index, we have something called as the dysphagia quality of life in Marathi. or we have something called a SWAL-QOL, which assesses the impact of swallowing impairment on a person's quality of life. Now, these are the, I spoke about in the previous slide, I spoke about that you could have a pediatric stethoscope and a pulse oximeter. Why? Because we could do some tests called as a cervical auscultation. Auscultation means hearing the sounds. So why pediatric scope? Because the pediatric diameter is very small. It will fit onto your thyroid cartilage. You ask the patient to drink water, and then you listen to the airway sounds. What I mean by airway sounds is after the person has had water, is there any noisy breathing? You ask the patient to say ah, you check for the phonatory sound to see if there's any wet gurgly voice quality, which will be picked up very well on your pediatric stethoscope. And you also look for swallowing sound. So when we swallow, there is a click sound that we get when the bolus passes through the cricopharynx. That is the cricopharyngeal relaxation. So we have to train ourselves to hear those sounds. With respect to pulse oximeter, now this instrument is very, very freely available, and many of our ICU patients are also under monitor of pulse as well as the SpO2, the saturation oxygen. So normally we know that our saturation oxygen should be somewhere around 96 to 99%. But if during the swallow examination you see that there is less than, more than or equal to a 2% drop, like if the person's baseline was 99 SpO2 and it falls to somewhere around 80, you feel that there could be a sign of aspiration. But again, friends, a word of caution, these tools cannot be used as standalone tools for diagnosis of aspiration. These can be used as an adjunct. So if you have any other assessment tools, these can be used as adjunct to give you a much more detailed elaboration on whether the oxyhemoglobin saturation was low or not, or whether there was any noisy breathing or not. That's about it. Please do not use this only as diagnostic tools. So when you do a clinical swallow examination, what are the signs that you would see? You would see that there is oral preparation problems or oral transit problems. You can see that the person may have very weak chewing, may have dribbling of food, may have a lot of residue in the oral cavity after he's tried to swallow. With respect to the pharyngeal phase, he may not have a swallow reflex or he may have a delayed swallow reflex. You can see things coming out of his nose, leading to nasal regurgitation. You can have coughing before, during, or after swallow. So many times when the patient coughs, we say that, oh, aspiration was present. So no, we cannot differentiate between penetration or aspiration on clinical swallow examination. We will have to do a much more higher testing, which is instrumental assessment, which I'll be covering in my next section. But we can definitely know whether the coughing has happened or not. With respect to the esophageal phase, we could see any regurgitation or vomiting. So the good part about the clinical swallow examination is that they are quick and easily accessible. You do not need any special instrumentation. It also gives you a fair idea about what is happening with the swallowing. But very importantly, it misses silent aspiration. Now, what is silent aspiration? Silent aspiration, as you can see in this picture, is this is a picture of a video fluoroscopy, a modified barium swallow, in a person who has had Wallenberg syndrome. Now you see the barium passing through the esophagus, but you see a much more heavier contrast going into the trachea. And let me tell you that this patient had absolutely no coughing to the response. So now when the food is entering the trachea without any overt signs like coughing, we as clinicians would feel that fine, he has a normal swallow, he can start eating. But what happens typically is that this patient comes back to our clinics after 4 or 5 days with a high spiked fever. We do an X-ray and we see a lot of pneumonic plaques, and this patient has ended up because of aspiration pneumonitis. So again, the concurrence or the prevalence of aspiration pneumonitis is very, very high in the general population that we see for assessment and intervention. So yes, this is a very important phenomena which indicates that we should go ahead for instrumental assessment of swallowing. Now, with respect to the instrumental assessment of swallowing, now, why do we do an instrumental assessment of swallowing? Okay, so if we want to directly see the structures of the upper aerodigestive tract and we want to understand what is happening during the physiology of swallowing, the instrumental assessments are a to-go tool. Also, when we want to see what is causing the dysphagia, what is the severity of dysphagia, we can do instrumental assessment. To determine what is penetration or aspiration, now we usually use these terms interchangeably, but they mean very differently. Penetration is again when the food bolus enters the laryngeal vestibule but stays above the vocal fold level. We call it laryngeal penetration. Once the food bolus passes through the vocal cords and enters the trachea, we term it as tracheal aspiration. Now, I personally use this scale. It is the penetration aspiration scale by Rosenbeck et al., which was published in 1996. It gives you a very good gradation of the amount of penetration or aspiration. It is an 8-point scale, where 1 means there is no penetration, no aspiration. 2, 3, 4, 5 means there is penetration, and also it judges the ability of a patient to clear that penetration. And further, 6, 7, 8 is graded when the contrast has passed the glottis and there is absolutely no chance to clear. It will also tell us whether a certain bolus is safe, a certain consistency is safe to swallow, or we need to stop that. Very, very importantly, it will help us rule out silent aspiration and make us have a very clear decision on whether this patient is deemed for a per-os, that is oral feeding, or nil per-os, or he has to be on an enteral feeding tube. But then there are some contraindications as well. As I said, patients who are not medically stable to tolerate these procedures should not be deemed, and we should stop at the instrumental assessments. Okay, we need to ask very importantly for the consent of the patient. So if a patient is not willing to participate in instrumental examinations, I think we should patient. I've had a few patients who did not agree to go for an instrumental assessment. Also, if you feel that you as a clinician don't feel that an instrumental assessment would give you any other additional information and it would not change your clinical judgment, in that case also it is okay if you do not go with an So these are the two types of instrumental assessments that we very commonly use. One is the modified barium swallow known as the MBS, or video fluoroscopic swallow examination or swallow study. And the other one is the FEES, that is the flexible endoscopic evaluation of swallowing. We also do the sensory testing called the sensory testing, which makes it FEESST, or the FEES test. Now this is done in the radiography room. This is the X-ray machine. Everyone, I think all the hospitals have X-ray machines. So we can use that module and we can have cine videography with respect to the video fluoroscopy. This is the microbar suspension. It is available in liquid form and it is available in powdered form. You can make the consistencies that you like, depending on what you see in the clinical swallow examination, of course. This is flexible endoscopic evaluation of swallow. We use a nasopharynx. I usually use the 3.8 Olympus pediatric nasopharyngoscope because it is very easy to insert and it is less discomfortable for the patient. This can be done at bedside also. Okay, it does not require any great very fancy room setup or anything of that sort. This can be done at bedside also. Let us see what all are the indications and contraindications for each of these testing. So if you want to understand the complete swallow mechanism, you need to go for a video fluoroscopy. If a person has motility disorder or esophageal disorders, then FEES will not give you much of an idea. You have to go for a video fluoroscopy. If the patient is unwilling to participate for FEES, many of the patients would get scared looking at the endoscope. So in those conditions, we could go for a video fluoroscopy because there the patient has to swallow. And if you don't understand the symptoms are not very specific to a certain phase and you want to be very clear about what is happening with the swallow mechanism, so you can again go for video fluoroscopy. But a word of caution here is that when you are doing a video fluoroscopy, you are exposing the patient to radiation. Okay. Of course, we have dosimeters, we have radiation dosimeters on when we are exposing. So you cannot do a very elaborate half-an-hour assessment on patients with video fluoroscopy. That is not possible because you will end up radiating the patient and having many more organ issues. If you cannot, so here for video fluoroscopy, the patient has to travel down to the radiography room. So if that is not possible, patients who are allergic to barium, especially those who have CKD, the chronic kidney disorder, so those patients should be avoided with respect to this procedure. Pregnant women and people who have severely compromised airway should also not be recommended a video fluoroscopy. So there are two scenes that we get. We get two views. This is the lateral view. This is the AP, or the anterior posterior view. So here we can visualize the nasal cavity, the epiglottis. This is the hyoid bone. This is the vestibule of larynx. This is the piriform fossae. You can see the tongue. You can see the mandible. You can see the trachea. You can see the esophagus. And when the patient is turned anterior, so this is my anterior posterior view. This would be my lateral view. Okay. Here you can see the right and the left vallecula and the right and the left piriform. Now here it is superimposed, if you can see here, right? It is superimposed. So you would not know where the piriform sinus is filled up, whether it is on the right side or the left side. So even an AP view is very, very important. So this is how I will be showing you videos of normal and abnormal swallows in the next section. So you can see the lip closure, you can see the lingua palatal contact, you can see the tongue touching the palate. You can see how very well the bolus has been transported to the pharyngeal phase. You can see the hyolaryngeal elevation. Can you appreciate that? You can see that the bolus has been filled into the vallecula. Nothing is entering the trachea. Here we can appreciate the cricopharyngeal relaxation. And finally, the swallow has been achieved and the airway has opened again. So we can see all of these parameters, which are oral preparatory, pharyngeal, esophageal in nature. But what happens with fees is that in fees, we can see only what is happening in the pharyngeal phase and not during the pharyngeal phase, what happens before and after the swallow. I will show you that as well now. There are some indications for fees. If you need to see, so here if you see, these are, you're seeing opaque and indirect structures of the pharyngeal area. What fees allows you to do is, fees allows you to see those structures in the bird's eye view directly. Like you can see the arytenoids, you can see the vocal cords, you can see the vallecula, you can see piriform sinuses directly. If we know that so there are some patients who are intolerant to contrast medias or who have safety issues with respect to radiation therapy, so those are the patients who are going to be indicated for the fees study. However, people who have a lot of dyskinesia or who are agitated or who are tactile defensive or who are at risk for nasopharyngeal bleeding in cases of nasoangiofibromas, those patients cannot be taken up for fees. So as I told you, you can see the bird's eye view. So nasopharyngoscope is entered into the nasal cavity. It is hanging at the oropharynx, and this is called the home. This is the home view. Okay, we call this as the home view. Why? Because here we can appreciate the piriform sinuses. This is the vallecula. This is the right and the left vallecula. This is the epiglottis. We can see the arytenoids. We can also see the vocal cords, and we can see a glimpse of the trachea. And in the picture on your right hand side, this opening, when you ask the patient to swallow or burp, this is the opening of the esophagus. Now what we do is, again, we give a blue or a green dye liquid. We ask the patient to swallow. So this is when your swallow reflex has just started to initiate. What you would see is this. This is called the white out. Now this is a very important phase in fees, because when this is achieved, it means that the hyolaryngeal elevation has happened, the pharynx has contracted, and it has pressed on the light of the endoscope, leading to a burst of light. Next frame that you see is the larynx is slowly going down, but there is still the epiglottic introversion. And then this is your last frame where you see that the bolus has been cleared. So what I meant, I think it will be clear now, that you do not see what happens during the pharyngeal phase, but you can see what happens before, and you can see what happens after the pharyngeal phase. Now, if I have to compare and contrast between fees and VFSs, in VFSs, we can see all these structures, we can see all the phases, but VFSs needs a special room. Again, barium is very bad to taste. It has a very chalky taste, so it is an unnatural food source, and many patients would not like it. Radiation exposure also is one very important factor when we talk about video fluoroscopy. Fees, however, it can be carried out at bedside with real food. There is no time limit to which you could do FEES. You could do your intervention sessions also on FEES because there is no radiation exposure. And in contrast to video fluoroscopy, where you cannot see saliva pooling or saliva aspiration on saliva, you can appreciate the same in the flexible endoscopy. Now, there are some pointers for decision making. Before you take up a patient for intervention, there are a few things that you need to really make a judgment on. Firstly, what is the medical status of the patient, the cognitive status of the patient? What is the nutritional status of the patient? Like, is the patient losing a lot of weight? In that case, you would have to put him on enteral feeding, and then you would have to side by side continue your swallowing therapy. What is his breathing status? Very importantly, oral hygiene, because many of the times, even if you are only doing the dry swallow, that is the swallow, if the person has very poor oral hygiene, what is going to happen is there's going to be a lot of unhealthy bacteria in the oral cavity, which will penetrate in the lungs and cause aspiration. Okay. Also, assess for cough reflex. So cough reflex can be assessed on your spirometer, or you can just ask the patient to do a big loud cough and see what is his level of expectoration. Okay. Now, this is one question that I think all of us are asked. That is enteral feeding the solution to dysphagia management? Not at all. We need to understand that prolonged tube feeding, be it a nasogastric tube, be it a jejunostomy, be it a gastrostomy, comes with a lot of complications like infections, tube blockages, there is kinking, there is leakage. Many of our gastrostomy patients also have stomach-site infections. So what happens is that they are already battling a condition, maybe cancer or maybe neurogenic conditions. This adds to their problems. And not to mention, it also affects the disabling feeling that they have because of societal isolation. So tube feeding should be considered very specifically when there is very severe aspiration. And NG tube should not be kept for more than 2 to 3 months because it leads to a lot of infection in the nasal cavity in the oropharynx. In cases which you know would have chronic dysphagia, like you have Wallenberg syndrome, or you have degenerative conditions like MND, or you have a patient with dementia where you know that the condition will worsen, it is always better to consider a gastrostomy as compared to an NG tube. And please, swallowing assessment and intervention cannot be done in presence of tube feeding. I have cut it off. Why? Because our swallowing intervention starts in the ICU on day 1, provided the patient is medically stable. It is irrespective of whether the patient is on feeding tube or not. In fact, nowadays, removal of tracheostomy tubes and feeding tubes is made only on the basis of how much oral feeding is managed by the patient. So swallowing is a very important factor or a predictor which will help the intensivist decide whether the tube, the tracheostomy tube as well as the feeding tube, when it can be weaned off. So management again has to be patient specific. I won't be wasting much time on this because of the time due. So there are 2 main approaches. We have an indirect approach where we are training the muscles of the throat and the pharynx, and we are trying to work without the bolus. And then there is a direct approach where we work directly with the bolus. We have a lot of postural modifications, like we can ask the patient to turn his head to the weak side. This is typically in cases of a unilateral pharyngeal paralysis. So when I turn my head to the affected side, the bolus gets transmitted to the stronger side. Or if you see in this patient, she has undergone a mandibulectomy on the left side. So I have used a head tilt to the opposite side, which is the stronger side, so that it will help her to chew and swallow the bolus from the stronger side. This is a patient with near total glossectomy. He is using a head extended posture. Why? Because they have given a flap, which is the ALT flap, that is a thigh flap. They've reconstructed his tongue with the thigh flap, and that was providing as a slide for the bolus to go down. So we trained him using the head back posture. Many times for patients who take a lot of time to swallow or who have a delayed swallow reflex, you could use a chin down posture. Then there are some specific maneuvers and exercises that you can use. For airway protection, you can do a supraglottic swallow. You could do a supraglottic swallow. For patients who have a very poor hyolaryngeal elevation, you can use a Mendelssohn's maneuver. You can use Shaker's exercise. For patients who have a lot of substantial residue, you can ask a patient to bear down and do a very effortful swallow, like so that there is much more pharyngeal contraction and he's able to clear his residue. Also improving oromotor strength and range of motion by isotonic and isometric, which is a strengthening and your range of motion exercises. Masako's exercises, I'm sure everyone has heard of. You hold the tongue and then you ask the patient to swallow like this. Okay, so this Massaco's exercise helps the base of the tongue movement. Many of us use deep pharyngeal nerve stimulation in form of sensory stimulation, where the pharyngeal and the base of tongue structures can be, you can stroke and you can tap the structures with cold and sour bolus. Many a times we can use specialized utensils and we can use modifications in the bolus to achieve some amount of oral feeding before progressing to the much difficult consistencies. E-stim or vital stim is the new thing in nowadays, especially considering the last decade. So this involves placement of electrodes and passing electric currents to stimulate the oral as well as the pharyngeal muscles. However, this requires a certification and training and hence cannot be used randomly. Like, I don't use this because I do not have a certification in this. So let us see what evidence tells us about dysphagia therapy. Is there any evidence? Lots of it. In fact, postural modification, maneuvers, exercises, and environmental modifications will definitely improve the swallowing function of our patients. So coming to the take-home message, we know that we have looked at the pathophysiology, we've looked at the causes. So instead of disusing it and losing it, I think we should use the swallowing mechanism and improve it. Secondly, we have to have a tailor-made dysphagia management plan, because one shoe does not fit all, right? So it could not be generalized, it should not be generalized. Instrumental assessment are not only to understand whether there is dysphagia or not, they will also help you in evidence-based practice and to plan therapy sessions. And yes, I really like this. Together, everyone achieves more. That is what a team approach means, right? So this is myself with our head of the department of otolaryngology and our head of the department of radiology. We work together as a cohesive team, and I think together we all can achieve much more. So please believe in team approach. And don't forget that it is the quality of life that matters for a patient. For us, it is just a patient who comes with dysphagia. But then in many of our cultures, eating is associated with a lot of other things and emotions just than the health. So please, it is quality of life that really, really matters. And I would want to end the presentation with thanking all of you for your patient listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for very elaborated and well presented topic. I think, I don't practice dysphagia or swallowing. I'm mostly concentrated into audiology, but still it gave me a lot of insight into what generally happens and what we can do. I'm sure most of us, many of our people, like attendees, have some questions. We'll try and answer those questions in the second part.
Sure. Okay, so can I start reading the some of the questions that I have got? Yes, I will do that. Yes. So one candidate has asked me, would you recommend one-way speaking valve in tracheostomy patients? Yes, definitely. What we need to understand is that the tracheostomy itself does not really lead to dysphagia, but it definitely has drastic alterations in the way we swallow. Okay, so when a person is on tracheostomy, especially a cuff tracheostomy, what happens is the air passing through the vocal cords are reduced. So there is going to be a very reduced sensation. There is going to be a lot of reduced cough reflex. The sense of the saliva secretion or pooling being present in the laryngeal structures is going to be reduced. And very importantly, the patient will have a very poor deglutative apnea that I spoke about. So all these things are taken care or taken into account when we put a one-way speaking valve. So yes, I would recommend a patient who has a tracheostomy, provided he is able to tolerate deflation of cuff. If a patient cannot tolerate deflation of cuff, that means he is not able to breathe on his own still. So in that case, I would want his or her breathing to vitalize, and then I would proceed with that. And yes, there is a very strong link between dysphagia and decision making of closing the tracheostomy. Why? Because there are few parameters that the intensivists look into when they want to either downsize or they want to wean the tracheostomy off. The first sign is whether the patient is able to manage blockage of the tube. Secondly, what is the secretion management? So usually secretion management is low in patients who have dysphagia. Why? Because their swallow frequency is poor. Okay, so that's why the patient cannot expectorate or swallow the secretions produced in the laryngeal and pharyngeal area. Also, it is very, very important that the patient has a good swallow reflex and is managing some amount of nutrition. So there is a very, very strong link between dysphagia and tracheostomy downsizing and closure. We play a very important role in downsizing it also. So I wouldn't close the tracheostomy. If I'm using a 7 Chiles tube, I would downsize it to 6.5 or 6 Chiles tube, downsize it furthermore, then place a cork or a gauze piece, 25 or 24 hours of monitoring without any ventilation, and finally the tracheostomy can be weaned off. What colored agents can be used? General food coloring. Yes, you can use general food coloring agents. Most of them have to be FDA approved, so that can be used. Usually use a blue color dye. Don't avoid using yellow, orange, green. Green is still okay, but yellow, orange, red is a big no. Pink bodily fluids like blood, and you wouldn't know. Diet. Okay, so we play a very important role in management with respect to the consistencies. With respect to diet, if you want to calculate calories, I usually have it done by a nutritionist, because we are not really trained to calculate the type of nutrition required and the amount of calories required for different kind of conditions. So for example, a person who has chronic kidney disease, if I give a very high protein diet, I may end up failing his kidneys a bit more. So I think it is very, very important that that work is done by the nutritionist. I always have my nutritionist with me, and I take a call with respect to the consistency modification. So we work together. She prescribes what could be the ingredients, and I make the decision of the consistencies. Yes, an SLP can decide when to remove NG tube. In my setup, I write a requisition saying that patient is managing 70% oral diet or 80% oral diet. I always repeat my video fluoroscopies or fees, and I justify when the NG tube can be removed. So yes, we can remove the NG tube, but again, it has to be a consensus thing between you and the gastroenterologist or whoever is referring the patient to you. The decision lies with us. Like many of my oncosurgeons would say that you please get it written from the speech language pathologist or the swallow pathologist that you're orally eating. Okay, but why I'm emphasizing on the instrumental assessment is today is the time of evidence-based practice. So if I have taken an XYZ decision of removing the tube and I have the video fluoroscopies in front of me, I have justified my point that this patient can be put on complete oral feed and does not require any feeding tube. Assessment of gag reflex is important, yes, but it would not mean that the person will have dysphagia. 20% of our population who is normally swallowing will have a reduced gag reflex. So there is no one-to-one correlation between gag reflex being hypersensitive and aspiration as such. But yes, since we do the cranial nerve examination, it is an important part of the assessment, but please do not put one and one together. There is no direct relation between the same. Cervical auscultation, yes, is, as I told you, acoustic analysis can be very, very significant, provided you use a very good sensitive microphone. I think the new digital swallow workstation has it. I think Aish has it. I have not personally had much of experience with it, but I feel those peaks can be correlated with instrumental assessment of swallowing to give you a better idea about the mechanism of swallowing. So yes, cervical auscultation definitely has a role to play in clinical swallow examination. Selection of stethoscope, I usually use a pediatric stethoscope. Why? For two reasons. Number one, the diameter of the microphone is very small. Okay. Secondly, it is more sensitive than the adult stethoscope. Okay, so you could use that. And radiological knowledge with respect to video fluoroscopy and fees, I recommend that all of you take up some course online, or you can have first-hand information, or you attend any conferences which focuses on instrumental swallow examination, and that could, I think, make you very, very eloquent with respect to doing your instrumental assessments. You need to certification. We need certification for that. Vital stim with respect to esophageal dysphagia, unfortunately, I haven't come across any research which speaks about that. They do manometries and the other things as well, but I know for sure that vital stim definitely works for the pharyngeal muscles and the oral muscles. Important prerequisites to start a swallowing lab would be, like in our swallowing lab, we have a flexible endoscope, we have an endoscopist. I myself do endoscopies, and a few protocols would be good enough to start off with. There is a question on AIS. Is it androgen-induced syndrome, if someone is trying to ask? So these patients have a lot of other issues also. If they're not able to perform sequential swallow, we need to see why they're not able to perform sequential swallow. Is there a problem with delayed swallow reflex? Is there a problem with high laryngeal elevation? Do they have any laryngeal abnormalities? I think a very detailed assessment of patient with AIS would be required to understand the mechanism. As I said, it is XYZ is not able to perform a certain activity. Why? We need to explore why that is happening. Once we have the why, we will know how to do it as well. ICU rehabilitation of swallowing disorder, very, very good question and very important. So yes, if the patient is the protocol that we follow is post-stroke, if the patient is alert, awake, conscious, and cooperative, we do our first swallow assessment within 24 hours of referral. Ethical protocol for SLP treating dysphagia, we do have do's and don'ts. ASHA gives you very good guidelines as to what can be done, what cannot be done. I think in India also we are trying to make some protocols for the same with respect to ethical practice. And I think once we have a standard consensus everywhere, I think we all would be at a very at par with each other to have a very standardized method of delivering rehabilitation and swallowing. For oral care, oral hygiene, there is no specific protocol as such, but usually patients who are treated for oral cancers or stroke, they're usually given mouthwashes to keep their oral cavity healthy. Also, what I train my patients is that they tie a gauze piece on their finger, okay? They dip it in the mouthwash and they clean the oral cavity, okay? And then they look for the remnants of any edible which is left. Also, very important is that we train our caregivers, because we see the patient probably once or twice a day, but it is them who have to learn to suction, who have to learn to manage the oral hygiene. So using good hydrohexidine mouthwashes and a good cleaning, brushing, or a good oral hygiene with respect to saliva management should be enough. Okay, so for a patient who's on mechanical ventilation, I would not really do a very elaborate clinical swallow assessment. Why? Because these patients have a very weak respiratory control. And I, as my protocol, would like to do a cuff assessment. That is asking a patient to cough out and see how he's expectorating. So once I think he's weaned off the ventilation, I would do a much more elaborate assessment on him. Yes, he could be having a cuff tracheostomy, but he should be mobilized and he should be ready to be mobilized, or he should be able to maintain the mechanical ventilation being off. Yes, importance of knowing about vital signs for SLPs is very, very important, because you know that if a person has signs of aspiration, his SpO2 will reduce, his heart rate will go high. Okay. Anything above 110 beats per minute is considered abnormal. More than 2% fall of SpO2 during swallowing is considered abnormal. So those signs, and a person can either have a very high shot in blood pressure or a sudden lowering of blood pressure. So especially in cases who are premature, or this is also applicable in neonatal dysphagia, you have to have your eyes constantly on the monitor when you're giving the feed, okay, so as to catch early signs of aspiration or respiratory distress in patients. So yes, we have to have vital signs of vital signs, and we all should know how to do CPR. Okay, so if you're working in a hospital, they conduct BLS certification, that is basic life support certification, where they teach you to resuscitate a patient. They they ask you to give chest pumps, and they teach you how to do CPR. So I think all of us should get certified for that. I'm personally certified for that. Someone has asked me if we are going to get a certificate for this on this training. I think the organizer can kindly answer this question, because I'm not really aware of this. I'm sorry, Mr. Hassan. Have I left out any questions?
I don't think so, ma'am. Ma'am, can you hear me?
Okay, which consistencies do I use during assessment? Okay, so I don't use all consistencies on all my patients. I start with water. If the patient does well on water, then I would want to try. So first I take a very detailed case history. I ask the patient what all he's managing orally, which consistencies are difficult for him, which are easier for him. Usually I ask the patients to carry some consistencies with them. Okay, and depending on the patient's complaint, I proceed from a thick liquid to solid and then down to thin liquids. Is there any relationship between swallowing and snoring? Now, yes, if there is obstructive apnea, yes, it could have implications in deglutitive apnea. But again, snoring is seen in many asymptomatic patients also. So there is no one-to-one correlation between swallowing and snoring.
Ma'am, can you hear me, ma'am? Hello?
Are hiccups related to dysphagia? Yes. So hiccups are a result of inflammation or irritation to the diaphragm muscle. It is more to do with the breathing mechanism than the swallowing mechanism. Okay. So it is more concerning when your phrenic nerve is suddenly irritated because of an overload of distress. So that is when you start getting hiccups. But what we say is that if a person is getting hiccups, he should avoid swallowing during that time, because ideally when you swallow, the apnea happens, but when you're doing a hiccup, you're pushing the airway out, so then the food can enter the airway during that time. So no active dysphagia management if a patient has lot of hiccup. Okay, do we have different protocols for swallowing assessment for pediatric? Absolutely. So in pediatric dysphagia, the protocols are absolutely different in as compared to adults. If you are wanting to know about neonates, then there are some tools like NOMAS, neonatal oromotor assessment scales available. You can also have like I personally do a lot of non-nutritive sucking assessment on breastfeeding. Okay, so yes, your assessment protocol is going to be very, very different, and I would not want to subject any child or any neonate to a flexible endoscope or